what's up everybody? MGM back at you with another world building video. And this is a little video that has been inspired once again by watching some tabletop horror stories and also on some comments that I saw in some other videos that I watched. And they kind of touched on a topic that I base some of my world building on, and hopefully I'll be able to explain that to you during this video so you understand where I'm coming from there. Think of this video as kind of a base with others that will follow it. My player character video will be the same for players. My hope here is to lay out a basis and give a lot of ideas, and then in the future take some of those other ideas and be more specific about them. If there's any topics that you're curious about or having trouble, want a little inspiration or guidance, feel free to let me know in the comments below. I love helping out GMs and making their life a little easier so they can also have fun playing games. So by all means, reach out in the comments below. I will do what I can to help you and give you a little guidance. That being said, what am I talking about here? There seems to be this idea a lot of GMs have out there, a fantasy tabletop game and the world setting being realistic to medieval times. And I put that in quotes because that's very subjective, and we'll get into that soon enough. But in my experience, at least, when people say things like this, it's often a thinly veiled attempt to excuse certain unpleasant acts or to justify hatred of different kinds. Now, I'm in no way telling anyone how to run their world, or their table for that matter. But I figure if you came to this channel and you wanted a little guidance, I'm going to give it to you the way I do it, and you could take that as you will. So, as with all my videos, take everything I say with a grain of salt, pick and choose the things that work for you and your world and your table, and throw the rest away. Now, back to the topic here. I, for one, do not believe that in a world where there's magic and dragons and fantastical places and creatures, and where there's even the possibility of direct contact with deities and their avatars, I just don't believe a world like that would be exactly the same as the world we live in. This GM here feels that being a little more creative in your world building is in order. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm actually a huge fan of real-world history. I mean, a huge fan of real-world history. But similar to how I personally feel that real-world religion and politics have no place in tabletop RPGs, and I will do a video explaining that more in the future, I also feel that real-world history really has no bearing on the history of a fantasy world. The caveat here, of course, is if you're running a world based on our history. And that can be fun, but that's not my style of gaming. If that's your style, this video is probably not for you. And that's okay. I prefer to make the worlds that I create believable rather than realistic. Well, what does that really mean, MGM? I hear many of you asking already. Well, let me try to break it down for you. Let's start with realistic. I believe that this term can be very subjective and problematic because of that. Sure, there will be certain similarities with our reality, like the fact that we'll breathe air, moving in basic physics, the fact that people need to eat and drink. All of these certain base things, there will be similarities to between the real world and a fantasy world. But that's not the stuff I'm talking about here. These are the shared similarities, I think, that people often mistake for history and how people respond to that. I'm separating those two things, basically. So there's basic things that we will assume or at least share with a fantasy world, like what I mentioned. Even that on a very basic term, because in a world with magic where physics and the laws of nature can be twisted and turned around, those things can change. And that in itself makes a fantasy world a very different place. Now, with that being said, I mean, we are talking about a world of entirely different peoples. Even if they're human like us, they're still different people that have different circumstances and different places. And there's just everything is different. So I do not feel that they would necessarily have changed, evolved, or grown the same way that we did, based on that alone. Now, as I mentioned before, this is often also used as an excuse to normalize certain unpleasantries, such as oppression and other cruel acts that I just won't talk about here. Now, in many ways, this may also be used to limit the technology that's available, or to focus on certain weapons that would be available during a specific time period. But again, I don't feel you need our real world history to dictate that specifically. And this brings up the last thing that I'll point out about the idea of this realistic, is that this term realistic is very subjective. And this can differ greatly between GMs and can range from people that essentially take their idea of quote unquote medieval times from what they've seen on television shows or movies or other forms of fictional media, and can range all the way up to people who are actual historians that teach in colleges and such and want to use that education to create the world that they essentially live in during their days as they teach those things. Now, there's nothing necessarily wrong with any of those things, but if you think for a minute about it, it becomes problematic, especially in a fantasy setting. So let's move on to what believable is to me, or at least the way that I'm presenting it in this video. And to me, believable means it makes sense for the world that one is in. Because personally, I don't make the assumption that the people of a fantasy world with the many unique experiences and challenges that might arise in a world like that we just don't have, I don't believe that they would be exactly like we are. To me, a believable fantasy world comes from its unique history, environment, the resources available, the peoples that are there, the creatures that might be around, cultures and religions, the different rulers and ruling bodies that might rise and fall. In any given place, all of these things fit together and influence one another, and that's what makes it believable, is how all of the surrounding things interact and influence each other. And I think that's a really important part to think of when we're world building. When we're building a world, how does everything interact with each other? It's that appearance of interaction that makes that world believable, in my experience at least. And you can always scale this to what you want, from just a small scale town with a surrounding forest where they gather resources from, to an entire country and the different cities and city states and whatnot that may or may not exist in there. However you want to do your world, I mean, you can scale this to the degree that you want. I'm hoping to give you a little bit of guidance or maybe a little inspiration to make your world feel like a living place. This is one of the many ways GMs out there can be creative. And if you're an aspiring writer or author of any kind, this is really for you, and you guys know exactly who you are. How I like to start as a basis to the rest of world building is with a creation story. How was the world created? Now, it's up to you how simple or complex you want that to be, but have an idea of how your world started. All that stuff is really up to you, but have a creation story to the world. If you want that to differ between peoples like it does in real life, that's fine. But I would say, as the GM and the creator of this world, know what the true creation of the world is first, and then you can expand on that with other cultures later. And that's one of the ways you definitely flavor the world. Keep it simple at first is my typical advice, and I will echo that multiple times. However, the complexity is always going to be up to you. You're the one building the world. Take on what you think you can, but don't overdo it, because then it stops being fun. And you really want this to be fun, because, you know, that's kind of my channel's thing. When it comes to inspiration, real life has tons of different stories of creation from multiple different cultures throughout millennia. That's always great for inspiration. But there's also great fictional creation stories of fictional worlds out there as well. Tons of books and movies and TV shows even give you different types of creation stories. So be creative with how the world was created and make it unique. Make it something that speaks to you as a person, creating a world that you really enjoy and want your players to play in. I would also suggest that during your creation, think of the source of magic or whatever powers your players may have. Think of the source of that. Is it tied to the creation of the world? Did it come afterwards? Where does that come from? That's a great place to combine your ideas in the very beginning, and this affects how the world basically acts, reacts, and grows. After you have a basic creation story, at least, add some history. Now, this is a broad area, and all of you secret wannabe novel writers out there, this is a place you can really shine. I would humbly suggest that instead of writing railroad-style adventures, write a history instead. It could be history for the entire world or just for the area important to your campaign or adventure. But no matter how small or large a scale you want to do it, Write a bit of history, and don't forget to add in a hero or two here and there to spice things up and maybe give something for your players to aspire to. They don't have to be over the top, just give them some heroes. If you're not a writer, or you just don't want or need a lot of detail, I would suggest at least creating a timeline of important world or local events going back long enough to explain the current situations the players are in. Now, when I speak of important events, this can include tons of stuff, but some examples of that might be wars or battles and where and why they happened, advancements in technology or civilization, or magic for that matter, the rise and fall of different leaders or cults or governments, the arrival or disappearance of animals, creatures, monsters, migration of different people, the rise and fall of religions or gods themselves, natural disasters that happened or other major unknown calamities, the arrival of magic, the founding of places. You can see here that the possibilities are huge and endless, and just depends so much on the world and your creativity here. Now, this part here definitely crosses genres. You don't need to be in a fantasy world to do this history making and world building here. You can do the same thing in any kind of cyberpunk or Weird West or wuxia or superhero or any other kind of genre that you're playing, using history and making at least enough history to explain why the players are in their situation really helps the world feel alive and gives them more pause to want to explore the world that they're a part of and that they themselves can eventually affect. Once more, I always suggest simplicity, so scale back the history and only have it go as far back as you need to based on the situation you're playing. As you're the GM and the builder of your world, you go into the complexity you want to and have the time for. So let's put these things together here. What I'm suggesting is you take these events that you've created, this history you've created, and make sure that they influence the current world that your players are in. One way to do that is to look to local culture to support these ideas. Now, local culture in this context that I'm talking about here today can mean anything from a small group of people to a large metropolis, or even an entire country. It may include things like architecture and the types of homes that people live in, holidays and ceremonies, local social norms like manners and greetings, things like that, professions, goods and commerce of the area, local stories and the lore that you might hear, the songs and music of the area, the way that people dress, their language, the food that they eat, the drinks that they have, the type of art that they have, status symbols and the social hierarchy of that given area. What governs that area? What system governs it, if any? Do they have laws? What kind of laws do they have? Groups and factions of the area, why are they there? All of these things, and even more than just what I'm listing here, can give that history that you wrote life in the current world and make the world itself feel more believable and, better yet, alive. Now, as I typically do, I laid out a lot of things here for you to think about, and by no means do I suggest you do it all. Unless you want to, of course. What I'm suggesting is choose 2 or 3 of the areas of the ones I just listed above here and use them to add a little bit of flavor to a local culture. So let me try to give you an example here. Let's say that my players come to a new town. This town that they find themselves in now, they notice that the people, they all greet each other by bowing, by putting their hands over their hearts. They notice that all of the adult men and women wear hats that are ornately decorated and seem to be some sort of status symbol. They find that there's a local stew made from a hardy root plant that grows locally, and that root plant also provides a basis for a local spirit. Now, you can see with me just adding a few of these things and sprinkling them in, something that otherwise might just be another normal town has that little bit of spice that makes the place memorable and unique and different from other places they've been in. Now, to give you some closing thoughts here, I think you can see that there's so many ways to add flavor to your world that can make it believable. The trick really is how all of these things influence each other. The MGM approach is always to start simple and then add detail as time goes on, as your party adventures through. In fact, allow the players to influence the world around them through the adventures that they play, through their characters, or by giving some ideas of their own, but I think that's a topic for a different video now, isn't it? But hey, a big shout out to the people that have been commenting on my videos. Thank you so much for watching and being interested. Thank you again to my subscribers and the people who are continuing to subscribe. I really appreciate people enjoying listening to my rants on tabletop RPGs, a hobby that I love so very much. And to you who are watching this right now, thank you so much for stopping by and checking me out. Remember, everybody, that building worlds for tabletop RPGs is a wonderful and creative outlet that gives GMs the opportunity to shine through the interesting places they make, giving both the GM and players the ability to play for fun first. Thanks for watching, everybody.